Welcome to the Crystal Fideli podcast. I am your host, Crystal Fideli. I am a social researcher and policy analyst, speaker, consultant, and an award-winning nonprofit founder and executive director. And all of my work focuses on helping us to understand coercive control, helping organizations to understand coercive control so they can respond better, and helping individuals understand coercive control so they can navigate the systems that they need to navigate better. And here on the Crystal Fideli podcast at large, we examine when institutional norms and practices diverge from what the research calls an evidence-based approach, being based on science, research, the law, etc., and instead reverts into using what the research calls a practice-based approach based on tradition and opinion, and how it causes an immense amount of harm to very vulnerable and marginalized people. And that leads me into introducing you to a special series we are doing here on the Crystal Fideli podcast called When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response and the Cascading Consequences. We see in the research and in practice time and time again when a woman attempts to set boundaries on the coercive control that she is experiencing, how the coercive control does not stop, because that's not how it works. Coercive control does not stop when a woman sets boundaries. It just switches forms and it intensifies until a person in power or an institution steps in and stops it. So she attempts to set boundaries, and most often it switches to financial. And we examine the family court's response and how that leads to so many cascading consequences. So welcome to this. Today, I am so honored to be joined by Dr. James Jim Ptacek, whose work has contributed significantly to our understanding of how survivors experience abuse and how institutional responses shape those experiences. Dr. Ptacek is a professor emeritus of sociology at Suffolk University, and his research has focused on survivors' experience of intimate partner violence across different social contexts, particularly the ways social institutions, including the legal system, can either support or undermine their ability to achieve safety. His book, Feeling Trapped, along with his broader body of work, examines how multiple forces, including economic constraints, social structures, and institutional responses, contribute to survivors' sense of entrapment. His perspective offers important insight into how coercive control operates beyond the relationship itself and how systems shape the options available to survivors. Dr. Ptacek, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Yes. Thank you for coming. So to begin, I would like you to tell me about your study of domestic violence in social class. So what were the goals of your study and how did you research it?
Well, what I wanted to do in this study is really make visible all the many factors that cause women to feel trapped in intimate relationships. Making this visible was my goal. I mean, there's things that involve what abusers do in these relationships. There are institutional responses which can succeed or fail. There are reactions from friends and families which can either help or hurt. There are cultural rules about femininity and masculinity that are very much alive in this form of abuse. So I wanted to map out all of these kinds of things in a way that I would give the evidence that you need to understand these women's lives. So to do this research, I did in-person interviews with 60 women from different social classes. And I've categorized the classes as poor, working class, professional, and wealthy. All of these women experienced some form of physical abuse, along with all the other forms, psychological, sexual, and economic abuse. These women were free of violence at the time of the interviews, which gave them some perspective on their lives and on the process of separation. These interviews took between 1 and 6 hours to complete. Many of them had to be done over 2 different days.
Wow.
Now, my background is that I've been working on this issue for over 40 years. I did work as an abuse counselor at Emerge, an early domestic violence abusers counseling program. I did that work for 8 years. I've done trainings with mental health professionals, legal professionals, hospitals, and advocates over this period of time. And I've taught and researched on this in the Boston area.
Mm.
So that gives you a background. Everything I'm talking about today comes from the experience of these 60 women and their stories. In the book, I give long excerpts from their testimony, hoping that the reader would be moved just as I was by their testimony.
Yes, yes, definitely. And so how is financial coercive control understood within the broader framework of domestic violence and coercive control?
Okay, well, this is a big question.
Yeah.
So, as I've indicated, these women experienced physical, psychological, sexual, and economic abuse. And although we can make these layers and talk about this abstractly, these things all happen at the same time. Most of the women experience sexual abuse. Most of the women experience psychological abuse. Most of them experience economic abuse. And the way in which these kinds of abuse support one another is very complicated. So, on the topic of economic abuse, for example, the psychological things that many of these men were doing was to say to these women that they're worthless, they're nothing, they're stupid, they
Mhm.
shouldn't have their jobs. It's only bias that gives them their jobs. They meant to harm these women's sense of self and their ability to support themselves. So
Mhm.
that's the psychological dimension of it. There's also a physical dimension to it. These women were all afraid of these men. So when they threatened to show up at their jobs or take their jobs away from them, or they demanded their paychecks, it came with the coercion that involves fear of violence. So psychological, physical, sexual, and economic abuse is all happening at the same time. Now, in my book on social class here, I really wanted to go deep into this issue of economic abuse. And I detailed four different kinds of abuse. And Crystal, stop me if you can relate to these kinds of things. I'm sure that you're well versed in these. The one form of abuse that is missing from a lot of our scales on economic abuse is the unequal division of household labor.
Yes.
Now, I think we have to see that this is really important to everything that happens in women trying to escape from abuse.
Yes.
If women are assigned the responsibility for all the housework and childcare, and if there's physical coercion that goes into this, they're unable to support themselves in the best way that they can because they're responsible for all the house care, the child care. We saw
Mhm.
this vividly under COVID. So in the first year of COVID, over 3.5 million mothers of school-aged children left the paid labor force. And why did
Wow.
they do this? They did this because daycare collapsed and in-person schooling collapsed. And since this is the unequal share of their burden, they lost their jobs, they lost that economic security, and this made them more dependent on men.
Yes.
Most women in my study were angry and resentful about this sense that only women can do this work and women must do this work. So this is a key element of economic abuse. The
Yes.
second element is go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I'm totally agreeing with you. I am so happy to hear an expert talking about this. So go ahead.
So economic control is the second form of abuse of an economic sort. And here I'm just talking about ways in which men seize control of money. And I have a question for you, Crystal, about this.
Yes.
First of all, many of the women, even in the wealthy and professional households, had no idea of what was in their bank accounts. They didn't understand. The men would lie to them about this, pay cash for foreign cars, take their mistresses out of the country on weekends, and the women had no sense of the money that was going on in the household. And in fact, many women were put on allowances. This was especially a tactic of the professional and wealthy women. Can you make sense of this for me, Crystal?
Of why they do it, why the men do it, or
Or, I mean, is this something you've heard of women being put on allowances?
oh, yes, yes, definitely. It definitely. I see women put on allowances all the time, and I see this is where I'm not trying to criticize the family court, but I'm just trying to tell what I see in practice and what the data validates. But I see the family court not only allowing enabling, but in many cases ordering, to happen is women being placed on allowances despite contributing economically equally to the marriage and the marital division of labor. Yeah, does that answer your questions? Because I can like
Yeah,
keep going
yeah.
on that topic.
I mean, it's so condescending. I mean,
Yes,
this
yes,
this is something you do with teenagers or something
yes,
like this, right? I mean,
yes, yes.
so I mean, in my talks about this, I find that, even in, supposedly non-abusive relationships, a lot of professional wealthy women are put on allowances. This startled me how common it was.
And I think something you really highlighted was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just sort of, I see this interconnectivity between financial, well, I don't think you said this, but this is what I was getting from it, the interconnectivity from financial economic abuse and psychological abuse, because I think being degraded, being demeaned in that manner is psychologically taxing, and it almost breaks women to be treated like a
Right,
child, like a dependent, like a second class party in the marriage. And quite frankly, when they go through the family court system, when the family court almost triangulates with the perpetrator of abuse, treating them like a second class litigant, that
yeah,
they are put in the position where they are the ones who have to almost beg over and over for basic equitable access to the marital income, to maintain the marital financial status quo, and to fund litigation on their side, right? So they can ensure parity, so they can meet their basic needs of them and their children as they arise, and to fund litigation. But the family court allows them to be put in that one down second
right.
class position. So,
Well, in that way, the court sort of extends the psychological abuse that's going on in
yes.
their households, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So in the testimony that they gave to me, the pattern that I saw most profoundly was that these men were attacking these women's identities,
Yes.
their identities as mothers,
Yep.
as wives, as daughters, uh, as teachers. Anything these women took pride in, these
Yep.
men would attack.
Yep.
And it was a powerful form of abuse, which undermined them terribly, and is one of the key things that caused them to feel trapped. So there's a clear connection here. In a way, if you would list out all the things that these men said to these women, it sort of displays their motives for the abuse. They really saw these women as second-class citizens. They saw them as
Yep.
economic competitors.
Yep.
They saw them as failed women
Yep.
in so many ways, and this justified their mistreatment of them, it seems to me.
And then the issue is that when she sets the boundaries, and she sets the boundary from the course of control continuing to manifest emotionally, psychologically, maybe even physically, right? And she leaves, then the coercive control I see a lot then switches to the lever of financial. Well, it happens in the marriage too, the economic abuse, but a lot of cases I see maybe the woman wasn't abused economically in the marriage, but then when she leaves and she gets out, then it switches
Yeah,
to financial. And but then she goes to the family court and she asks for what she's entitled to, which is equitable access pending proceedings. And I'm not an attorney. This is just for informational purposes. But NJSA 2A34-23 says that both parties are entitled to equitable access pending proceedings. And so if proceedings are underway, well, procedurally, I mean, both parties are entitled to equitable access. But we see over and over again that she has to keep going back and begging for the
right.
basics of what she's entitled to, and he doesn't. But she is, forced. But and here's the thing, though. But and then there's correct me if I'm wrong, or I'm not sure if you're aware. But it's well documented in the literature about caretaker bias. It's like almost like the male is seen as economically independent because I guess they quantify independence economically as, oh, you have a job. But then that goes back to what you were saying about not seeing the caretaking labor,
Right.
and she's seen as not economically independent, and she's seen as the independent one. But that's not true. There's an interdependence on both of their parts
Of
because
course.
he's relying on her caretaking labor to enable his income, and they almost force her into staying in that interdependence to continue to enable his
Right.
income. Whereas now she's expected to, in most cases, under severe deprivation, where the money's just pulled out from under her like a rug pulled out from under her, and she has to proceed pro se, and he has an attorney on his side. And she's expected to, well, why didn't you go out and get a job and build a whole new economic, structure in addition to the interdependence, when he just gets to remain interdependent, benefit off the
Right.
interdependent when all the risk goes on to her.
That's
So,
right. Yeah, and so much of this is just not visible to the court. They
yes.
don't recognize this. They don't recognize the inequality of this.
And my
The
question
thing,
is why? I don't
yeah,
understand why. And that's where I appreciate your sociological, perspective on this, that this is a matter of, just our sort of cultural zeitgeist that I guess we need to really talk about and change.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
the third element of economic abuse that I saw was sabotaging of women's jobs and schooling.
Yep.
And this leads to a puzzle for me in a way. So looking at the poor men who mostly did not have legitimate income and the working class men who had often seasonal labor or jobs without benefits, these are the men that were most interested in sabotaging women's jobs and schooling. I mean, it was in their interests, you would think, to support their jobs and schooling. But this is how important domination was to these men. They were willing to suffer a loss of household income in order to feel one up over these women. So
Mm.
it was just remarkable to me that this was the most important thing that they could be doing. So a lot of women dropped out of school because of the abuse. Some men would show up at their workplaces and make big scenes that cost women their jobs. Some women would have their jobs called up by the men, telling lies about the women so as to get the women fired. There are all kinds of ways in which these men undermine these women financially, deliberately, their jobs and their schooling.
Yeah. It's awful. And it's really super awful when they go to the system for protection and the system doesn't acknowledge it. But I don't understand why. And so, um,
They
yeah,
just
it's
don't
really
want to
sad.
understand women's lives. They don't want to understand the realities, the material realities of women's lives around having children, it seems to me.
Which
The
is,
last
yeah,
element that I found was called economic exploitation. Here is when men actually seize things that don't belong to them.
yeah,
So they would demand control over women's paychecks. They would take women's property. They would destroy their property. As you're pointing out, after women separate, this abuse continues. And sometimes men would just drag women into the court for years
yep,
over custody and child support matters just to harass them and empty their bank accounts.
yep,
So this was another dimension of economic abuse. And together, it just seems to me that this group of men were looking to get involved in like a class struggle with these women that would undermine them, that would put these women underneath their thumbs. Succeeding over women economically seemed to be a big part of the motives going on here. As a result of all this, these women were highly dependent on their partners because of their responsibility for childcare and house cleaning and all the rest of that. And the abuse exacerbated this dependency. They were afraid that when they left, they would fall lower in class, that they would have fewer assets. And for many of the women, this came to be absolutely true.
yeah. And that's why I always say, when you see, and of course, my nonprofit work really focuses on the financial coercive control, because I really see just that is the sort of issue for which everything cascades from, right?
Mhm.
If you can't have parity to ensure that you can afford basic necessities, how are you going to even be able to participate in the litigation process, right? If you
Right.
don't have money to afford an attorney, how are you going to participate in the litigation process? But everything sort of cascades from there. The like you're mentioning, the custody, the parenting time, the litigation abuse, dragging these women into court. I just did an interview where she's like, I'm in court 2, 3 times a week. It's, like it's a full-time job, and I'm pro se, and he has representation because he's a multimillionaire. And so my whole thing is, hey, courts, when you see a woman being economically abused, like cut off from the marital income overnight,
that is a really good indication that there was and or will be coercive control manifesting through other levers, psychologically,
Yeah.
physically, custody, litigation, etc. Either was happening, is still happening, or will happen. So you need to address it firmly, hard, and quickly. So you de-incentivize it. Otherwise, it doesn't go away. It just gets
Right,
worse.
right.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, years and years and years and years, right? Of
Years and
this.
years and years and years until the kid is 18. It's so unfair. It really does entrap women.
Yeah. So there's a joke among activists where women who are survivors would say, "When do I get to be a formerly battered woman?"
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
when does that happen? Because it goes on for so many years. They're dragged around in so many ways for years. They're
Yes.
afraid. They're still in danger.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. It's really so sad, and it's why we're doing this work here. And really it's just all because the perpetrator of the coercive control just seeks to have power and control over their victim. And I really appreciate the, sociological perspective, because I think a lot of times the professionals think that this is a matter of mental health, and it's like, it
right.
might be. And I think underneath it all, like, it might make it worse, but I think the root cause is a sociological sort of root cause, how our unconscious, or rather subconscious, beliefs about men having power over women, and a woman's place. Would you agree with that or disagree, Dr. Ptacek?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, the word I use throughout the book is patriarchy, and this is a word that has fallen out of favor for reasons I don't understand.
Yeah.
All we have to do is open up the newspapers and see vivid elements of this all over the place.
Yes.
But I really develop a theory of this that looks at the different institutional processes that go on in there. And one of the key elements of patriarchy is women's unpaid and unacknowledged labor.
Yeah.
You know, there's many other things that go on, but this is certainly a key element of this.
I will be totally honest with you. I was one of those folks that I was like, no, the patriarchy is a thing of the past. I mean, is there any statutory laws where, it says women can't do this or that? And then I realized, no, in effect, and these court orders do function as law for the parties in that case. And it might not be in the statutory law, but it is embedded in the institutional norms and practices.
Right.
And man, I was wrong. I was so wrong. In effect, patriarchy is still alive and well. It was such a realization. I was
Yeah.
so wrong.
It
So,
changes over time. You know, it assumes different forms, but it clearly is still with us.
and I feel so horrible that I didn't see it before, but I guess I can't go back and change that now. All I can do is, move forward. Well, I guess I'm making up for it, right? With building a
Well,
nonprofit.
you're
And
engaged in it full time, it sounds like to me.
yes,
So
I am.
I'm not concerned.
Yeah. Um, so how, I mean, I think we've already talked about this, but if there's any more that you think you can or would like to contribute to, how does financial coercive control contribute to a survivor's sense of feeling trapped, even when they attempt to leave? I guess we did talk about that, but is there anything
Yeah.
else we should
Well,
mention?
what I will say is that women at all class levels spoke of economic elements as one of the reasons that they felt trapped. It was one of the key reasons for the poor women, for the working class women. I thought the professional and wealthy women would have more assets and the rest, but all of them, even though they had more education than their partners in the professional and wealthy classes, they made less money. And so they were in an unequal relationship economically, and the men, even in those classes, lorded it over them. For the poor men, the goal was getting a hold of assets. For the professional and wealthy men, it was really monopolizing the assets and lying about them.
Mm.
Uh, Economic issues were a source of conflict that led to violence at every class level. This is a key element of abuse, clearly. And it goes on long after relationships are over. The child care things alone make women extremely vulnerable. And this is the thing that they've talked about the most, that kind of economic vulnerability about having kids.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because a lot of attorneys even will say to a caretaker, well, you have to be reasonable. Like you should be working. Income's going to be imputed to you. One of the women on my team, I mean, she was like homeless and they were imputing income because he had moved the mistress with her two children into the marital home. And she's homeless, and the court's imputing income to her when she had her son who has a diagnosis of autism, and they were in a homeless shelter. It's just wow.
It's hideous.
It,
What you're describing is just hideous.
it is, and this is the norm. And then the really horrible thing is that these women will report over and over, and this is the best way I can explain it, is how they are treated with a lack of professionalism, a lack of respect, like
Right.
they lack credibility. And he is treated, and I'm saying he because historically and still today, overwhelmingly, the women are victims of this, and the men are the beneficiaries of sort of the way this plays out. But he is treated with such professionalism, such respect, like he has such credibility. And the only thing I can think of, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think the court is misinterpreting her. So she enters family court, and this is a good segue, I guess, into the next section. So she enters family court. Well, maybe it's because this is sort of how I view my work. So, the coercive control, and then she enters the system. What is the response? And then what are the cascading effects? But so she enters the family court. She has had the income ripped from her overnight. And so she's experiencing active deprivation. She can't afford her basic necessities for her and her children. And so obviously her prefrontal cortex is going to go offline, and she's going to be in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? And so she's going to be
Right.
hyper vigilant. Also, she's being coercively controlled. And whereas he is entering the court system, he has more than his basic necessities taken care of. He actually probably has an elevation in lifestyle because he's taken the money completely away from her and the children. And he's also controlling her, which I guess is maybe how he finds safety in his nervous system, is by controlling. And so he's not hypervigilant. He's soothed. He's completely fine.
Right.
And on top
Right.
of that, he can afford legal representation to sort of become aware of his substantive rights and to know the proper procedural steps and mechanisms and how to properly say in procedural language how to request from the court what he needs, while she's speaking lived experience and harm language. And I think the court I think they misinterpret him having a job as economic independence and credibility, and they fail to see, no, he's actually economically interdependent on her, and really he's exploiting her. I know that's hyperbolic language, stakeholders, but I can't come up with a better word. I have to workshop that. I have to think of a better word.
Well, I think the word is really accurate.
Yeah.
And the pattern that I saw in the wealthy households is that there was kind of a bait and switch going on around women's work. So women would be encouraged to leave their jobs and work
Yes.
for the wealthy men.
Yes.
Okay. Now they're actually off the books. Okay.
Yes.
They're not, there's nothing to report to Social Security or anything like this.
Yes.
And now the man, once this happened, said, but this is my money. This is not your money. I'll
Yeah.
do whatever I want with this money.
Mm-hmm.
So that was going on in some of the wealthy families. Exploitation is really what we're talking about here. I see no problem using that term.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, and this is why, I think the law, at least here in New Jersey, I don't know the law for other states. And again, I'm not an attorney, social researcher, policy person over here, but I was a paralegal. But this just functions for informational purposes. NJSA 2A34-23, so New Jersey statutes annotated 2A34-23, says that both parties are entitled to equitable access pending proceedings. And there's case law, Malamo vs. Malamo and its progeny related cases, that says the same, and courts can and should use rough justice to ensure equitable access pending proceedings, because caretaking is equal economic contribution. So income earners, it's not your income, but this is sort of the crux of
Right.
my work,
Right.
and the thesis of
Right.
my work is
Right.
that harm happens from systems when institutional norms and practices diverge from evidence. And in this case, the evidence
Right.
is the law. And so I don't understand why. And so we sort of move into this practice-based approach. And that's where I see harm happening a lot, when it moves away from evidence-based. Again, in this case, which is the law. And I know that, the legal side is not necessarily your expertise, Dr. Tasic. It's the sociological side. But what I'm trying to make the point of is that the law recognizes that it's not his money, it's
Right,
marital money, but the
right.
courts don't even treat it like that.
And he still gets away with it.
He gets away with it. And that's where sort of I think the patriarchal underpinnings of just the beliefs that the
Right.
system actors have. It's
Yeah.
like overnight, he can just take off with the money, leave her to function in the marital division of labor, the caretaking, and he's doing the income earning. But all of a sudden, overnight, now it's his money
Right.
and she's a dependent. No, it's like there needs to be a reasonable and responsible transition period where her caretaking comes down so she can step up her income earning, and where his income earning comes down a little bit so he can step up his caretaking. So we meet somewhere in the middle. But what's happening is that she's expected to keep her caretaking up here and also raise her income earning. And he's just expected to keep his income and that's it. Caretaking is just, if he wants to come be in their lives, oh, he's a great dad. Look, he wants to be involved. It's not equitable and it's not okay. And it needs to change because it's causing harm. And it's why women don't leave. And that's why
Right.
my work really targets the coercive control.
When you look at divorce, after divorce, men's economic status stays relatively the same,
Yeah.
women's collapses.
Yes.
And it's for
Yes.
just the reasons that you've described. These habits, these cultural rules about women's responsibilities are just made invisible by the court, and they don't see the reality of what's going on, it seems to me.
And I would say in contradiction too with what I think the law intends. So yeah, it needs to change. The only bright side I can think of, Dr. Tasic, is that family court really relies on discretion. So I'm thinking maybe if we could get in there with opening their eyes to this different perspective,
Yeah,
maybe it can become more equitable, So
maybe that's the hope. We certainly can't give up.
yeah.
Let me talk a little bit about my experience with the legal system in terms of these women's testimony. Now, it doesn't
Please.
fall so much in the family court as it does in police and child custody kinds of issues a little bit, but mostly police issues. So most of the women in this study, these 60 women, the institution they called on most often was the criminal legal system.
Mm.
2/3 called the police or had them called by friends, neighbors, or relatives. Now, the response of the police can be seen as falling into three categories. Sometimes the police did just what the women wanted. They wanted the man removed from the home. They wanted some safety while they packed their belongings. They wanted some sort of symbolic sense that this was wrong, and that was communicated by a state official. In some cases, the police actually saved women's lives. Several of these women almost died, and police action saved some of their lives in the process. So sometimes the police did the right things, and and it was recognized by the women. But a lot of the times it was just ineffective. So many women had the police come a number of times, dozens of times. The police would come, they would talk to the person, they would file reports, they would do things. Sometimes they'd arrest the men. In the most cases, though, the women said it made no difference. All this activity, all these phone calls, all these police cars, all this traffic, all the rest of this seemed not to matter in reducing the violence. And then we have a category of hostile responses to women.
Mm.
Officers that would express their frustration and anger with the women in their interactions. There was one case in which a man had friends in the police department, and the woman was going there to get photographs taken so she'd have a strong case in both criminal and civil court. And the officers said, don't file charges against him. He's such a nice guy.
Ugh.
They were bonding with this man around this. Sometimes police officers would say, don't call the police again if you're not going to be acting properly towards me. I'm not going to bother.
Mm.
So the hostility that they received from the police was its own category. We've got a lot of patriarchy in police responses to women.
And what about if he is law enforcement himself, the perpetrator?
Well, we
That's
know from some of the research going on now that there's quite a bit of abuse in police relationships.
yeah.
And of course, real problems with accountability and any kind of rules that would cause men to lose any kind of status or even their weapons in these kind of cases. So that is a serious problem, without question. One police officer said to a man, here's what you do. You go to court first and file the restraining order first. And that way, when she files a restraining order against you, it will have no power.
Ugh.
So this is advice from police officers on remaining patriarchal in your relationships.
Yeah.
Sometimes the police would be extremely rough and violent with Black suspects in ways that caused Black women to fear the police and fear that when they call the police, they're opening up a whole bunch of racist practices, which makes them question whether this was the right thing to do in the first place. So sexist and racist responses by the police were part of what women described in these interactions.
Yeah. It's not
Many of
okay.
these women took out restraining orders or orders of protection against the men. And when they had advocates present to walk them through, people like you, Crystal, they especially appreciated this. They appreciated the sense of having someone explain the legal processes to them at a
Yes.
time when they're upset and overwhelmed and looking over their shoulders, right?
Yeah.
Again, I had to ask, sometimes the judges wouldn't believe them and wouldn't give them orders.
Yep.
But even if we look at the women who got orders, my question was, did they actually reduce the abuse? Most women said no, they did not. Again, all this activity, all this time, all this involvement with the court, and it didn't seem to help so much.
Yeah.
Some men were the target of criminal charges filed by their partners, and some of the men did get convicted and serve time. The difficulty with child sexual abuse was that they had a hard time getting the courts to believe that their abusive partner also abused the children. A number of women went to great lengths to try to have that happen. They were all failed in this process. And women expressed great anger and bitterness over these efforts again and again to go to court, arguing about these kinds of things, which cost them so much money, time, and energy.
Yeah.
Now, the word that's used here, this pattern that I've already mentioned, of men using their economic power to drag women into court again and again, among advocates, this is called domestic abuse by proxy.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, maybe the relationship is over. Maybe they don't have their hands on the woman anymore.
Yep.
Maybe there's a divorce that's in process or something like this. But by dragging the woman back into court again and again over child custody issues, child support issues, or whatever they can think of, this is kind of a way to continue the domestic abuse. And this was reported by the women, especially the women in professional and wealthy households where men had the money to afford legal advice.
Yep, that's exactly what we see every day. And that's why, it's so important for the court to not allow a man to get away with the exploitation of a woman, even in the initial phases, because they'll say, oh, I have discretion. Oh, this is temporary. Oh, this is, I'm narrowing the reading of the case and or statutory
Right.
law.
Right.
And, it's like, no, temporary harm, like literally Malamo vs. Malamo, short-term harm leads to long-term irreparable harm. It cannot be repaired. And a lot of these women, they go into mediation, right? Without an attorney. He has one with the marital
Right.
income. And they're like, oh, no, you don't get an attorney. You don't need it. My discretion. And it's just like, but discretion is supposed to operate within the bounds of the law. Like there's a definition of discretion. It's supposed to operate within the bounds of the law. And the law exists for a reason. Again, the institutional norms and practices, I do believe, are diverging from the law intends, and it really affects the rest of the case because then we'll have exactly what you're seeing: domestic abuse by proxy, because they got all the money because they starved her out. I mean, she's literally doesn't have enough money to pay the mortgage and bills and
Right.
utilities, let alone to hire, counsel to become aware of her substantive rights and how to properly put this before the court, because the court wants it properly put before it, but they won't give her access to her marital income that she's enabling with her caretaking so she can hire an attorney to have it properly put before the court. But do you see it's kind of like a double
Yeah.
bind that, well, of course
Right.
you see it. This is the basis of your work. But
Right.
yeah, and it's horrible, and it just keeps on going. But if they ensured equitable access for both parties, she would have a better shot, and maybe this wouldn't happen. Not maybe, I do believe, because I do believe if institutions interrupt it, it helps it greatly, if not stops it. So,
Okay, so I'm interested in just question of time here. I don't want to
yes.
run over. How long are we going?
I don't have anything for another 45 minutes if you want to
Okay,
go over, or we can
okay,
stop when we were supposed to. It's up to you.
okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other institutional responses that women had, and they are a little bit better than their experiences with the courts.
Yeah.
So women, I'm grouping under the category helping professions, women's experience with doctors, with religious leaders, with domestic abuse programs and counselors. About half of the women went to domestic abuse programs, and women of all classes found these extremely helpful.
Hmm.
So advocacy really comes out well in my book. Women, in many cases, only got in touch with these programs after they had already left. But these programs still did tremendous good for these women, especially working on issues of guilt, shame, and depression.
Yes.
Shelters were used by only a small number of women, mostly poor and working class women. For the professional and wealthy women, they saw shelters, I think, as really for the poor.
Yeah.
So there's like a stigma around this.
Yeah.
And that stigma doesn't just go to using the shelters, it goes to women's confusion around whether they're actually abused women.
Yeah.
Women in professional and wealthy households would sometimes doubt whether they experienced was abuse because this is something that was supposed to only happen to poor women or women of color or immigrant women.
Hmm.
So some of these services under the helping professions were also kind of stigmatized.
Yeah. No, that's a really good observation. I didn't think of it like that. That is true. It's My daughter says that she wants to, my 8-year-old daughter, she's the reason I created the nonprofit in the first place. It was originally to help women who were pregnant and left to navigate alone, because that was my story with her. I was left to navigate alone. And because of my child abuse background, I didn't have anyone to support me. So we were like homeless when she was a month and a half and food insecure and all the things. The day after we became homeless, the engine in my car blew. It was awful. When it rains, it pours. But anyway, so she said she wants to have a shelter for women, but she said, Mom, I don't want it to be musty. I don't even know where she learned that word from. But I guess that really plays into her
Yep,
sort of schema of
yep,
what a homeless shelter is too. She
right.
wants it to be like a spa. So she said it 3 times. So we are actually going to start the project together. I'm involving my 8-year-old, but that really does play into, she even has sort of a stereotype of a women's
Mm.
shelter being musty. So
Yeah, that's interesting as you pick this up. I have to interrupt you and just say,
yeah,
Crystal, I'm so
please.
sorry for what you've experienced. I'm so sorry for all the abuse that you've experienced
Thank you.
that brought you to this place.
Thank you. Yes, it
Now,
was
a number of
awful.
women did seek counseling, and those that could afford it really appreciated it. Some tried couples counseling, and couples counseling is
Yes.
not recommended by people with backgrounds working on violence against women. Some of the men would decide that they would stop going. Some of them would lie when the process was going on, were unilateral about their participation. It didn't work that well. But the individual work that women did with therapists was very beneficial.
Yes.
They felt supported, they got access to resources, and it changed their feelings about themselves in the wake of violence. Now,
Yes.
doctors played an interesting role. They also looked pretty good in my study. Almost half the women were seen by doctors because of the violence, frequently in emergency rooms. Often women would not tell the doctors the truth, but the doctors could perceive the truth anyway and would say supportive things and convince women to come back if they needed to, or convince them that they were in extreme danger and should consider leaving. And there were several turning points in women's stories based on responses by doctors.
Hmm. Yes, that's very good. I really do think doctors, police, court professionals, we really need to, marital counselors, as a pastors, like we really need to create broader public awareness and change that the root cause is a sociological root cause. It's a belief system of a woman's place and a man's place of having power, and that he is to have like power and control over her.
Right,
Definitely need to educate these specific key institutions and
right.
professionals to recognize power and control.
Yeah, you mentioned religious leaders, and this was something that was brought up by women also. Some of their experiences with priests or rabbis were beneficial, especially around divorce issues and reassuring them that this is not something to worry about getting divorced. But most women who went to religious leaders regretted it.
Yeah.
Some of them got terrible responses. Religious leaders seem to not understand the phenomena of violence against women, of different kinds of abuse. One minister said the survivor made her bed and should lie in it.
Oh, Lord.
Another told a woman that since she was not married, she was living in sin
Oh,
and who was
gosh.
unwilling to help a sinner. Some
Ugh.
didn't believe survivors. Some religious counselors were especially bad, it seemed. One woman went to her counselor, she saw two of them, religious counselors, and told them about the physical and sexual violence she experienced. She was told to make a list of the things that she needed to apologize to her partner about and try to seek his forgiveness.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's
So
awful.
this is again bias of a very deep kind in these kinds of institutional responses. Uh, the advocates came out well, the medical personnel came out well, the counselors came out well, but the patriarchy in the religious leaders was really quite profound.
And that is actually really near and dear to my heart because I am a Christian, and it's just so crazy because I struggle to say that sometimes because it's like, no, I'm not talking about the Christianity where you don't apply critical thinking and reading the text, because if you read the text, and also the translations also lose actually what the original language meant. Like, Greek is a very expressive language. One Greek word can mean like five different English words, and we just translate it, or it's like mistranslated, or it's translated to a word to mean not what the original text actually meant. And there's a lack of critical thinking. And it's, if you actually read, Jesus protected women. Jesus, he protected women, and he I mean, the first woman to preach the gospel was a woman. He said, "Go and tell my disciples Jesus is risen." And but the church, again, well, maybe this is sort of going back to the thesis of my work, is that when institutional practices and norms diverge from evidence, and the evidence here would be the actual Bible and text, right? Yeah, it just is really, really sad because I think that they have thwarted it. The religion of Christianity has thwarted what was actually originally intended, and we see harm caused so badly. But just to get back to a sociological, lens again, I mean, why is it that, well, I guess we've answered this, but why is it that she has to make a list of things that she has to ask forgiveness? Why is
Right.
he not told by the
Yeah.
religious leader to take responsibility for what he did?
Yeah,
So,
it's just remarkable. I mean, thankfully, there are now many religious leaders who are organizing against this kind of violence and abuse. Certainly in the Boston area, in Christian religions, in Jewish leaders are doing this. There's books, there's trainings. I've had a chance to speak with some of these folks. It's really hard work. It's really important work, but you're going up against deep, deep cultural biases about this.
yeah. And really particular in the Christian world, because there's that whole idea that, like, I guess a wife is supposed to submit to the man and the man is the leader. And it just, it's supposed to mean that he's supposed to serve everybody. He's not supposed to be the king of the
Right.
castle kind of, head or whatever. It's supposed to be servant leadership like Jesus. Jesus got down and washed his disciples' feet, which is kind of weird for us to say in 2026 America. But back then, that was a way that he demonstrated that he was serving, the people who followed him. So we've talked a lot about, the institutional, responses. So in your view, how can institutions, the responses help women escape abusive relationships, Dr. Tasic?
Well, I'm a big believer in uh, advocacy, changing institutions. I mean, I've done many trainings of all kinds of people, and there is something to trainings, but there is something magical that happens when you take a group of advocates and you place them inside a hospital,
Ah,
inside the courtroom,
mm,
inside the police department,
mm,
because now you've got people on a daily basis who can accept referrals and resources and who can challenge the cultural practices.
Mm,
These are also things that a lot of people in these trades don't want to deal with, don't have the background to deal with, and they're happy to have someone else deal this with them. So when we can have advocates, people like you, do things like this, it can matter. I think I mentioned to you in one of our conversations my experience in Milwaukee, where they had right in the Milwaukee County Courthouse
mhm,
a advocacy center staffed by a local feminist organization, and
mm,
they would change women's locks for free. There were
mm,
classes on child abuse. There were opportunities for job training. There was legal advice about what to do when you come in front of the judge, what kind of things he's looking at in terms of evidence, how your abuser is likely to respond to this, and what sense to make of that. This was right in the courthouse.
mm.
So if a woman comes into this courthouse and doesn't know that she should stop at the advocacy office, a judge will say to her, make sure you talk to Jill on your way out. She's there in the back room. She can help you with this. She can help you understand these processes and open a big basket of social resources towards you.
Oh my gosh, I never thought of it like that. Having, them inside the courtroom, the police, like whatever sort of institution it is to change the culture. I didn't think of that. That is brilliant. I wrote that down.
Yeah,
That's why I
yeah.
keep looking down. I have a pen. I write notes when I do interviews, so I can touch upon something that I think that really stood out. Well, maybe you made a way. My dream is to have you made a way be, the organization that, the courts like have on their literature to send, women to. So we'll see if we
Right.
get there. Hopefully the wind is with us, right?
Well, there's certainly enough need, that's for sure.
Yes,
There's no question about that.
yes,
We need more advocacy of this kind. We also need advocacy that really grows out of particular communities and responds to the needs of people in those communities.
yes.
So when I've talked to women who work in immigrant communities and communities of color, what they tell me is often that they don't trust the police. They're afraid of the police.
Hmm.
They want mechanisms for guaranteeing safety that don't rely on the police and the courts. They're afraid of the police. Their abusers also tell them if you go to the police, they're going to deport you
Yep,
when that may or may not be the case.
yep,
Right now, it's a hard time in the culture for
yeah.
people who are undocumented.
Hmm.
And you can
Yeah,
imagine that people in these communities have a lot of feelings about this.
yeah,
There's violence in these communities just like there is in other communities, but resources have to be made for meeting their needs and not assuming that since this community does well with the police, that this community is also going to do well with the police.
yeah,
So I'm a big believer in that kind of homegrown advocacy.
yeah.
Unfortunately, we're at a time when funding is really being cut dramatically. So I understand that since 2018, the Department of Justice, their U.S. Crime Victims Fund has decreased 70% since
Mm,
2018.
yeah.
It's decreased 40% just since 2023.
Wow.
The Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women has withdrawn many of their grants and many of their support for community-based operations.
That's the one thing we need to not gut. That's the one thing we need to keep. Yeah.
That is to me pivotal. So staffing at shelters, staffing at rape crisis centers, at crisis intervention centers has been cut dramatically over the years.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, this is where I have the greatest faith in having people understand women's experiences, understand the kind of resources they need, and have this at their fingertips to make a difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. The domestic violence and sexual assault nonprofits, it's a very niched, sort of counseling service that they give because they really understand power and control and the function of that, and they really incorporate that when they help survivors. And it's very niche. It's not something I find that you're going to find with a regular general, therapist or counselor. And so, it's really, really needed. Um, so let's talk a little bit about lessons from, the research and feeling trapped. So one of the concerns that this research explores is the many ways that women feel trapped in abusive relationships. So, um, I mean, we probably talked about this, but is there anything we should add to what did you learn about the factors causing women to feel trapped?
Well, I think that I give a little map at the end of my book, a visual map of all the things that we have to talk about when it comes to making sense of abuse. And we've mentioned a number of them. The responses of friends and families, the court, the medical profession, counseling, the legal profession. All of these things play a role. So the key term that I keep using in the book is social entrapment.
Mm,
Social entrapment.
yeah.
Women's experiences of violence, their ability to resist or escape violence is based on a lot of factors, including friends and families and institutional responses. This is the theme that I go through in that book. And what that does is it reveals a whole host of areas that need reforms.
Yes.
So even when we have things in place, the kind of institutional processes that are going on are often corrupted by racism, by sexism, by contempt for gays and lesbians. And that kind of corruption just undermines these responses. And now they become more part of the trap rather than part of the way that women can resist violence and escape violence. So you're asking a very big question. There's many elements of this. There's lots of things that I learned are really poorly understood, including my own sense of this going into the study. And that is just how important these economic issues are going up and down the economic scale. So I found that for wealthy women, for example, there's ways that privilege actually can be part of what causes them to feel trapped. So,
Interesting.
for example, uh, I mentioned that even when women have money in these relationships, the men always have more money for the most part, and then they control it. They use this power to threaten women, and women in wealthy relationships, men in wealthy relationships can say, I have standing in this community. No one is going to believe you when you come forward with this.
Mm,
They use their resources, their economic resources, to threaten and undermine women in a specific way in privileged communities.
yeah.
Women in these communities are also told, and maybe you've heard this yourself, that they're supposed to tolerate the abuse because of the men's status.
Yeah.
So, what are you complaining about? You have it good.
Yeah.
You're part of your signing on with this executive person is to put up with this. And women are warned not to get divorced, not to call the police because it will bring shame on this community. Because after all, this is only supposed to happen among the have-nots.
Mm,
So
yeah.
that kind of shame, that kind of sense that you're supposed to tolerate the abuse is clearly going on, even with the wealthy women. And many of these wealthy women felt that even given the status they had in this community, if they got divorced, they would lose class status. And that happened to be true for many of the women. They lost out, just as we're describing. After divorce, their status falls while the men's remains about the same. So there's specific traps, even for women in these wealthy communities, traps that are really strengthened by economic biases and falsehoods about who is really going to be an abused woman.
Yeah. I think the answer to that is really changing the culture and the value that we give to caretaking as equal economic contribution to the income earner. Because it's like, what if something happened to that woman? Like, what if she was unable to take care of the children, or gosh forbid, she wasn't with us anymore? Well, the caretaking would fall to him. So it's equal economic contribution. I mean, some people, what if he told her, "Hey, I don't want you to work. I want you to stay home," or, yeah. And that's why I think our culture really needs to like understand that some families split up the merit. There's something called the marital division of labor. Marriage is an economic partnership, and couples split it up the way that they choose to split it up. And who are we to judge? But both parties are contributing economically equally. Um, and we really need to understand that women have just as much of a right to money as men have to money. I guess it's a sociological root cause. The more I'm speaking with you now, and other people I've had on the podcast, other experts, it really is a sociological root cause. It's just insane because it's just subconscious beliefs. Where do we even get these beliefs from? Well, I guess we get them because they're in the zeitgeist of the culture that's passed down through generations, but it needs to
Right.
change. So,
It certainly does.
yeah. Um, Given what you have learned, what do you think would best help women escape relationships? I guess we just touched upon that, just uh, changing the subconscious beliefs that our culture holds, right? Or what would you
Yeah.
say?
Well, we need more and more people to take this seriously and get involved with this.
Mm,
And get involved with advocacy of many kinds. Of the women that I interviewed, many of these women ended up becoming advocates themselves. They would
mm,
speak out about this. They would work in shelters. They would work in programs that women's support communities. And this was actually part of their healing process.
yeah.
It really helped make a difference in their lives. It gave them a way forward and a way to contribute, to take their experiences and put it to someone else's good. So we need more and more people, women and men, to take this seriously and get involved with it. And in a way, this is really the time to be alive to do this. There are so many opportunities here for involvement.
Yes.
There are many different ways in which this is being dealt with in the military, in religious organizations, in high schools, in colleges. There's many ways to get involved with addressing this issue. So we need more volunteers. We need more activists to be part of a broader cultural change to bring this around.
Hey, we used to teach women right back in the 1950s how to be a good wife. Maybe we need to teach how to recognize abuse, right? In high
Yep,
schools.
absolutely, absolutely. Maybe that's too late. Maybe grade schools.
Yeah, I agree, actually. Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. I've written that down. I just wrote that down. And I like how you said men and women, right? It's not just
Right.
women who need to get involved, but men need to get involved as well. I like how you highlighted that.
Yeah. I mean, there's men who are involved with the local Boston area Rape Crisis Center, which is a
Mm,
very strong and powerful organization,
yeah.
doing really wonderful good all over the place. There's certainly men involved with working with abusive men. There's men involved with teaching on these issues, with addressing this in sports. There's a brand new book out just now in this past week on violence against women and sports,
Mm,
research and policy. There's many avenues where people can get involved and do something useful, whether they're coming at this with ideas of being a teacher or a counselor or a policymaker or a politician or a
mm.
doctor or a nurse. There are roles, there's ways of getting involved with this issue and taking it on.
Yes, yes, definitely. Um, well, I will say this. I guess it was a part of my healing too. I mean, I started a whole nonprofit. It's been very healing to actually get on the, sort of research and, policy, side and really boots on the ground practice, sort of things as well. And it just validated the fact that something we have here at You Made a Way is we have a lot of survivors who are starting chapters, like, in the various different states. And we have more and more signing up each day to bring You Made a Way to their state. So I guess that really is a part of their healing as well. I never thought of it like that. It's healing for them to get involved in You Made a Way. So, so this conversation, um, is a part of a broader effort to better understand how financial coercive control operates during separation and how institutional responses shape economic stability and access to justice. So before we close, I'd like to ask just a few final questions. What do you think, Dr. Ptacek, judges, lawyers, and policymakers, what do you wish, I'm sorry, judges, lawyers, and policymakers better understood about financial coercive control?
I wish they understood that this happens in every class context,
Mhm.
that, in a way, abusive men understand the sources of women's strength and they work deliberately to undermine them.
Hmm.
And the economic stuff is absolutely core. So
Hmm.
if they could understand that, and it's going to look different for the working class men and for the poor men than it does for the professionals and the wealthy men. but it is animating their abuse. It is inspiring violence in these men, these economic issues. I don't think they understand that. I don't think they see this. I think they give up on uh, any efforts to make financial recommendations, any remuneration for injuries. I just think that the courts have given up on these things, and they fail to understand how pivotal it is to abuse.
Yeah, I really like how you pointed out how these economic issues do inspire violence because I think that a lot of these institutions just see, oh, well, the money thing, it'll just be sorted out later. And it's like, no, you are actually literally enabling and partnering and not stopping abuse. And so we need to get the message out there. Um, and so that I guess that's the change you would like to see is really for them to understand that it's not just a dispute over money. It is active abuse and it gets worse,
Right.
right?
And it
Um,
keeps on going after the relationship ends, after
yes,
separation.
yes, yes, yes. Um, Last question. What do you think researchers and policymakers often misunderstand about how systems contribute to survivors' experiences of entrapment?
I think that people fail to really fully develop the kind of biases that corrupt these systems.
Mm,
Biases against women of color and against men of color, biases against Native Americans, biases against immigrants, and ways that these corrupt how they're acting, ways in which even child protection is biased against folks of color in many ways
yeah.
and is the object of much activism to reverse this. These kind of biases are still with us. There's a lot of people who think that racism is part of the past, sexism is part of the past. Didn't we talk about that? Isn't that over? It's not over, and it makes these institutional processes horrible for many women, and it causes great suffering not to be able to attend to these kinds of things, it seems to me.
Which then in turn affects the children. Yeah.
Always,
Yeah.
always, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ptacek, for joining this conversation and for sharing your expertise. So, where can our audience learn more about your work?
Well, you can get my book. I map out the whole thing. It's got great material there. I think it's good material for trainings. I know it's being used in domestic violence trainings across the country and in several parts of the world. And it's meant to be of practical use. It's meant to sort of map out these elements of why women feel trapped in order that we can address them and reverse them. So that's really the goal of the book. And there's a lot in there about that. So you should pick up the book.
Awesome. Sounds good. Dr. Ptacek, thank you so much again. This was such a wonderful conversation. And thank you just for coming on and sharing with our audience.
Thank you for your time. And I so appreciate the good work that you're doing on this issue.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for another episode inside of our series called When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response, and the Cascading Consequences. If you are an organization or an event and you are looking for organizational consulting, speaking, or training so you can understand coercive control better, so you can respond better, I want to invite you to go ahead and visit me at crystalfidelli.com. If you are an individual leaving coercive control and you would like support navigating, I want to invite you to go ahead and also visit me at crystalfidelli.com. And if you are interested in specifically supporting You Made a Way, it is the 501c3 nonprofit that I founded and I am the executive director of. If you are just as passionate as we are of making a way for women and children who are leaving coercive control when it turns financial, I want to invite you to go ahead and visit us at youmadeaway.org. And we hope to see you back here next time for another episode of When Coercive Control Turns Financial, the Family Court Response, and the Cascading Consequences. See you then.